I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. Everybody, welcome back to our ongoing seminar on Merkavah literature. Now we're really knee-deep into the apocalyptic, and what I'm trying to show with a bit of a deep dive into the apocalyptic is a transition internal to Judaism where the failure of the Deuteronistic theology in the wake of the Babylonian captivity generates a new kind of religiosity within Judaism. Now, again, as I'll show, that the apocalyptic doesn't completely subsume the Deuteronistic theology, which is still present in Judaism down to this day. But what it does do is it gives Judaism a kind of escape valve, such that when the apocalyptic, or rather when the Deuteronomistic theology fails, because it inevitably will fail, the apocalyptic is there basically to save Judaism from itself. So this is a theological teeter-totter that basically, in some sense, Western history has been driven by this kind of teeter-tottering. And I would even say that in some sense, when the teeter-totter goes violently in the direction of the apocalyptic, it even throws off religions. And one of those religions that it threw off in some sense was Christianity. And so this sort of teeter-tottering back and forth is incredibly generative. It's quite dangerous, but quite generative in the history of the Western world. But it begins in an important way, as I pointed out last time, with the Enochic literature. And so we shouldn't say that we shouldn't really talk about the Book of Enoch, rather, we should say that there's a kind of Enochic literature, of which the first book of Enoch, containing several books, in fact, is the initial foray, along with Second Enoch, Third Enoch, and in some sense, you could even say that some of the Dead Sea Scroll literature, as we'll say, is Enochic in character. But the two things that I want to say about the Enochic literature as a kind of review before we get a little bit deeper into the apocalyptic literature today is that, one, we do have ascent narratives. That's the main breakthrough in the Enochic and in the apocalyptic literature. No longer is the sky breaking open a la Ezekiel, but rather people are going into the heavens, they're going into the divine world, and that travel to the divine world is obviously going to prime the possibility of the Merkavah tradition, where this can be induced. So in many ways, what we're seeing here is we're seeing narrative descriptions of apocalyptic journeys, and in some ways, the Merkavah mysticism will, in a way, be a way of practicalizing that. And another way of putting this is Merkavah mysticism is practical apocalypticism. It's the ability to take the apocalyptic and do it. So no longer are you reading about Enoch traveling into the heavens, rather you are practicing apocalypticism as a kind of mysticism. And in that way, we can understand that literary apocalypticism takes the form of something like Enoch, but in many ways, we can understand the Hekhalot mysticism as practical apocalypticism. So that's the first thing to point out here in terms of this. The second is part of the journey process involves some kind of transformation. Internal to the logic of Judaism, there is the idea that one cannot approach holy things in a regular state of affairs. You have to be a special kind of person. You need to be born as a Kohen, a priest, or a Levite. And even among the priests and the Levites, you can't approach the holy things without, in fact, undergoing some kind of purification techniques And in those purification techniques, you're allowed to advance into greater degrees of holiness. What the Enoch literature does, and what's really began in some ways by Isaiah, is the idea that now non-holy people can approach the divine, right? So rather than being a Kohen and a Levite, which are those are the only people really allowed into the inner recesses of the temple, what we have now in the Enochic literature is at least anybody can do it, right? At least Enoch can do it. And again, Enoch is there well before the establishment of the priests and the Kohens, and therefore there is an idea in which, some sense, there is a democratizing of the access to holiness. The apocalyptic greatly entrenches the idea that there is greater access to the apocalyptic, and with the Hekhalot literature, there's a sense in which anybody can do it. It becomes a radical democratization of access to the divine and the holiness of the divine. But that process still involves you undergoing some kind of transformation. And we remember in Enoch, it takes a form first of kind of angelification, that Enoch's clothes are changed. He's anointed with oil, right? His face begins to shine in a very much in a sort of mosaic kind of way. And by third Enoch, of course, and perhaps one of the most shocking moments in Jewish literature, in my opinion, Enoch is converted into a kind of minor god, Yahweh Katan, little Yahweh. And God, he is converted into this. And this is going to set the stage for Jewish bitheism. I think Jewish bitheism will exist prior to this. We'll talk about that a bit today. And of course, Jewish bitheism is going to set up things like the Trinity. The Trinity grows out of Jewish bitheism and the idea of the so-called two powers in heaven heresy, which we'll have a lot to say about later on. Lastly, what I'll say is, it says a review of the Enochic literature, is that there is a kind of anti-establishment sentiment in the Enochic literature. In the same way that the Enochic literature allows people access to holiness in a way that is inconceivable given the Levitical code, in which only Kohens and Levites can access to the holy, this is militated, I suspect, by a kind of anti-temple sentiment that we see in the Enochic literature. So they're critical of the earthly temple, and because the earthly temple is somehow corrupt or otherwise problematic, you can go to the celestial temple. And that temple, of course, is incorruptible and perfect, and you can go to that one. And the Enochic literature is read by Himmelfarb and Schaeffer and other people as a kind of anti-establishment, anti-temple literature. And with the sons of darkness, the Shemyaza and his horny band of teenagers coming to Earth to have sex with human women, they're defiling themselves in some ways. Himmelfarb and other people read this as they're being tantamount to the priests in the temple in Jerusalem. So again, a contentious reading, an interesting reading, but I think an important one, and perhaps true and certainly worth mentioning. This apocalyptic literature gets deepened in other texts produced after Enoch, and the most important one for at least our purposes here is going to be a text like the Testament of Levi. In the Testament of Levi, and this is part of the larger branch of Testament literature. This is a big genre of literature in history. And by the way, yes, that image of the sacrificial ramp is basically accurate. People have no idea how big the temple was. When you think about it in history, yes, it was massive. That was a giant ramp for burning animals on. People just, I don't think, have a real sense of just how enormous these structures were in the temple. I mean, you can imagine that thing piled high with animal remains and oil and wine, huge fires burning constantly. At any rate, in the temple of the Testament of Levi, which is again part of the Levi or the testamental literature, what we have is Levi is actually brought up into heaven, right? He is the founder of the Levites. He's brought up into heaven, and there he's allowed to see the angels. He visits the celestial temple, and what we find in the celestial temple is that they are doing bloodless offerings. Again, the angels are acting as priests in the celestial temple, but the sacrifices they bring are bloodless. And this is a larger part of a larger transition that we see in people like Porphyry and other people, Philo, where literal animal sacrifice is being denigrated for other forms of sacrifice during this time period. Intellectual sacrifice, Porphyry was not a big fan of animal sacrifice. Other kinds of non-animal sacrifices were being generated, and the Testament of Levi has this. And again, the idea is, if the
the celestial temple's sacrifices are bloodless, and the earthly temple's sacrifices are bloody. Again, maybe there's some denigration of the earthly temple here. But Levi, in the process of being anointed to be sort of the eternal priest and the authentic priest, perhaps again, unlike the inauthentic priests that exist on the earth, he is transformed into a kind of new priest, into a kind of celestial priest. He's allowed to join in with the angels through this process again of angelification, and in that process, he's allowed to go into the celestial temple and offer some of these bloodless offerings. Secondly, not only is Levi allowed to undergo this angelification process, but he also imagines that he's going to be generated as a kind of new priest. And one of the things about this novel priesthood is that this new priest won't die. The new priest won't die. He will serve on the earthly temple, and he will be able to serve forever. There's a kind of eternality to this new priesthood. Now, if that's sounding a bit like New Testament stuff, you're right, it is. There's a reason why Paul talks the way that he does, because he's getting a lot of that apocalyptic stuff from texts like the Testament of Levi. And further, this is the reason why you have the dual Messiah theory that emerges in the early sort of Second Temple period, where there is a Davidic Messiah and a priestly Messiah, and both of them will jointly rule forever. The origins of some of that stuff are being found here in the Testament of Levi. But what we don't get is that we don't get a lot of the ascent vision itself. We don't get Levi's ascent vision. In fact, he just seems to be taken up, and it seems to be relatively instantaneous. There's not a lot of layers and things like that we would expect somehow. But further, what we also get is we don't get a vast sense of the landscape of the heavens. Unlike in Enoch, where we get these paradoxical unveilings or paradoxical apocalypse, where we see fire and ice being blended together to form the structure of the celestial temple, here we're given very, very spare depictions. The reason probably is that this text is meant to be basically polemical against the earthly temple, and therefore the authentic priesthood is the celestial one, and Levi is being tapped into that celestial priesthood. But it is a very early ascent literature, and it is worth mentioning here again vis-a-vis this business with the priesthood. Now, there are a ton of these, right? We could do an entire class just on these apocalypses. But the apocalypses that really matter for us in terms of ascent literature, in terms of traveling into the heavens, are going to be the apocalypse of Abraham, the ascension of Isaiah, which I've done an episode on, the apocalypse of Zephaniah, and the apocalypse of John. Now, it may strike you as a little strange that I include a piece of Christian literature in here, but let me impress upon you that if you were to go back in time with a copy of the New Testament, as we know it, and put it into the hands of a Jew, the only book they would really recognize as authentically Jewish is the Apocalypse of John. The Apocalypse of John is hands down the most recognizably Jewish book in the New Testament. And that's somewhat conspicuous considering that many Christians find it to be the strangest book in the Bible. And so this odd book, the Apocalypse of John, fits very comfortably in the larger apocalyptic genre of literature at this time. But a couple things that are important about these texts, as I'll go through them and just sort of highlight some of the important details here, is that in almost all of these stories, God remains very distant. There seems to have been a backlash against Isaiah and against Ezekiel where they come the closest to describing God. And even then, it's, like I said, very sort of circumspect. It's like this, it's the form of that, it's in the mood of this, right? These texts withdraw on that even more. And there's a theological reason for this. They withdraw from that because the apocalyptic literature's main theological emphasis is the sovereignty of God. God is in control of everything. And as one theologically maximizes the divine sovereignty, that deity becomes distant and more distant and indescribable. So the function of the apocalyptic literature, part of the function of the apocalyptic literature, is that by making God very, very powerful, in some sense, what happens is God retreats. God retreats in this literature, and God becomes very unknowable and distant. Now, that's going to generate a kind of paradox, because into some sense, yes, you want to maintain a sovereign God, and you get a very transcendent, distant God. But that creates a problem. you still have a covenantal theology. How do you have a covenant with a God that's fundamentally removed and indescribable in all sense? You have covenants, you have agreements, you have a brit with a person. You need to somehow maintain the personhood of God. So what happens here? You have this very transcendent God, but you need to introduce something to bridge the gap between that radical transcendence and immanence, us down here on the earth. We need something to connect. We need some connective tissue. So what happens? The apocalyptic has to bring in some connective tissue, and that connective tissue is the glory of God, the kavod of God. It's going to be very powerful angels like Enoch being transformed into Metatron and becoming the lesser Yahweh. That becomes the connective tissue that links the radical transcendent God to an immanent God of the Deuteronomistic theology is the introduction of intermediaries. Now, what is going to happen in this? What's going to happen in this is that this is going to generate the idea that there are two gods. This is sometimes referred to as Jewish bitheism, or to use the language of the Gemara, it's sometimes referred to as the two powers in heaven heresy, where there are two powers in heaven. There is a remote, distant God, and there's some other deity that actually does the work of sort of, day-to-day God work, judging people and all the things that God does. So you need two gods, basically, right? You need two gods. And this is going to show up in the famous story of Metatron in the Gemara we'll talk about later. But also this is going to take the form of things like the angelified Jesus, right? The angelified Jesus in the Gospel of Paul, where Jesus becomes angelified, becomes glorified, and becomes basically another God. And that sets the stage, of course, for things like the Trinity. But already in the inner logic of the apocalyptic is this problem. And the solution for it will be to introduce intermediaries. And those intermediaries typically will take the form of angels. Now, because God remains quite distant, and for instance, the apocalypse of Abraham, we don't get to see God, but we do get to hear God. The voice of God becomes the thing that one encounters. You're going to see God, but you do get to hear God. And so that's going to be important in the apocalypse of Abraham. There's going to be a sense in which the angels are going to need to get demoted. Because while the angels are great, human beings are, we're narcissistic creatures, right? We want to be better than the angels. So what do? We demote the angels, and we say that some people do get to go and visit the glory of God, but only after death. Now, again, I want to reiterate just how radical this is, because most of us are really used to the idea that after we die, we're going to go somewhere and be close to God. At least those of us who are good, I probably won't end up there. But many of us, right, have the idea that you die and go to heaven and you get to see God. And that's great. That is an idea that is utterly foreign to Israelite religion. You die and you go to Sheol. Now, what happens in this literature? The dead, people will die, and the righteous dead will be elevated above the angels, and they will get to behold the divine glory. So already at some level, right, death becomes the gateway to ascension. And so at least at this level, right, there's the idea that human beings can ascend to higher realms, but typically you got to die first. And it's a bit inconvenient, but that's how you get there. Now, where this idea is coming from is not clear. This could be coming in from Hellenism. I think that it probably has some Egyptian origins. The Egyptians are really the folks who really have a very strong idea that after death, you are able to you ascend literally into the circumpolar stars, and you're able to live there forever, or you go to the Duat or whatever. At any rate, this idea enters into Judaism, and afterlife as we know it first appears, right, in the apocalyptic literature. So again, imagine the radicalness of this literature. They're literally inventing things like afterlife, topics that we all take to be completely normal, but did not exist in Israelite religion. They are developing it in the apocalyptic. And the righteous dead, of course, will get to see the divine glory. Now, we're also getting, again, these intermediary kind of angels. These are angels who are a little bit more than just angels. Angels in the Hebrew Bible are literally just postal service workers. They just go around doing what God tells them to do. They just carry messages around, right? That's all they do. They speak for God and they carry messages around. They don't really do much else aside from that. Maybe they have a military quality, like the Savaot. But look at one of the angel names here from one of the apocalypses here. The deity's name is Yahweh, right? Yahweh. Now, this is a very strange name because, as folks may know, Yah, right? I-A-O, is the Greek version of the name Yahweh. It's the Greek name of the version of the name Yahweh, and they've attached the theonym El to it. And this entity, Yahweh, actually becomes a kind of quasi-divine entity just slightly below the utterly transcendent God in some of these apocalyptic texts. This is another example, again, of where you get Jewish bitheism. The name of the angel is literally the Greek version of Yahweh, right? So the angel is Yahweh El. It's almost redundant. But again, this is what's driving the apocalyptic theology, is you need to be able to do, you need to get some of these angels. Remiel, another kind of really high-level angel who's somehow superior to all the other angels in that he's in a manifestation of God. This happens also with Metatron and other kinds of entities. Notice that both Metatron and Yahweh both have weirdly Greek substructures, linguistically Greek substructures, probably. All right, that's just an interesting thing that's worth mentioning. Now, of course, in the Apocalypse of John, which is very much influenced or under the theology of Paul, who we'll be talking about a good bit next week, notice that the Son of Man, which in traditional apocalyptic theology represents all of Israel, the Son of Man has now been hypostasized into a deity too. And now the deity that has been hypostasized into is Christ. So the Son of Man, previously in the Danielic literature, typically represents Israel as a whole. That's been substituted out. And now what the Son of Man represents is, again, an intermediary God. In this form, the form of Christ. So again, Jewish bitheism already present in the Apocalypse of John, here compounded with Christ and the Logos, which we'll talk about more in just a minute from Greek thinking. Further, right, as I said, right, we have this, what I call sometimes angelic magnification, which is to say some angels get to be more than angels. And as I mentioned, right, this is a solution to this transcendence issue, and this becomes the foundation for Jewish bitheism and the so-called two powers in heaven heresy, which we'll be talking about when we get to it with Elisha ben Abuya. Further, right, individual bodies continue to undergo the process of angelification. This is a process that can happen to you after you die, but it's also a process that can happen to certain people who are ascending. So you can undergo this process of angelification. Now, when you hear this process of becoming like the glory of God, and that's the language that gets used in Hebrew, you should hear it as kind of kavodification, that you become glorious, right? When you talk about the glorified body, and for folks who've read the New Testament, you'll know that's the way Paul talks. He talks about a glorified body. You have to translate your thinking out of Greek and back into Hebrew and think about the glorification of the body as a kavodification. The only thing ever talked about as having kavod like that in the heavens is God. And so you're undergoing a kind of process of divination or angelification in this literature. And lastly, what I'd want to point out here are two things rather, is also in this literature, we began to get a kind of soul-body dualism. That is to say, the body can die, but the soul will live forever. Now, I know for folks who know about Egyptian religion, this is nothing new, but this is an idea that doesn't really exist in Israelite thinking. It's being incorporated into the apocalyptic and developed as an idea all of its own. Again, prior to this, you just went to Sheol, and that was it. But the flesh itself, the actual physical body, cannot approach the divine. It has to be transformed somehow. And how does it get transformed? It gets transformed by undergoing various kinds of purification processes that occur either down here, right, in anticipation of that, or being transformed in the heavens. And lastly, what's really interesting is that in the ascension of Isaiah, for the first time, we actually get a glimpse of what this might have looked like in practice. And because in the ascension of Isaiah, what Isaiah clearly ascends, but he doesn't go anywhere. He doesn't physically go anywhere. And it's very clear that in the ascension of Isaiah, he's in a type of trance. He seems to be eyes closed, standing still in a sort of meditative or trance-like state. And it is in that trance-like state that he is able to ascend up through the heavens and eventually reach the apex up there and by the divine throne. I think that, at least in my opinion, when we get the description of Isaiah in this trance state, I think that the writer of that text is describing something they've seen. They're not simply making up things. They're saying, no, I've seen people in this state, and they have described going elsewhere. And I think in the Ascension of Isaiah, for the first time, we get the tiniest glimpse into praxes. We get a glimpse that this apocalyptic ascent may have taken the form of inducing some type of trance state. And unsurprisingly, when we get to the Hekhalot literature, we're going to see the exact same kind of state in which the ascenders or descenders to the chariot are also in. So we're getting a glimpse, folks. I know this stuff is so tantalizingly small, and I get that it is tantalizingly small, but history, we're not entitled to anything. History will keep her secrets. That's just the way history is. We're lucky to have anything at all. And the fact that we have even a glimpse into these ancient esoteric practices, it's amazing that we have what we have. But at least in the Ascension of Isaiah, we have the earliest glimpse of something like a practitioner in a trance state or an alteration of consciousness, and that results in their ability to ascend into these areas. Of course, not only do we have this going on in the apocalyptic literature, but the clearest example of a community of people for whom the apocalyptic was their primary mode of doing Judaism, their primary mode of doing Judaism, are the sectarians at Qumran, the folks that we can refer to as the Yachad. Now, I know that we often want to refer to them as Essenes. They never once called themselves Essenes. Now, were they Essenes? Probably. They probably were. But exactly what's going on at Qumran is very mysterious, whether that was a late life place that people went, whether it was a library, whether it was a kind of monastic retreat center for the Essenes. We don't know exactly what Qumran was. But what we do know from its literature, the literature that survives there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that there's a lot of shared overlap between the folks preparing the apocalyptic literature and the folks at Qumran, the Yachad. First thing that's important about them is that they see themselves as priests. They see themselves as a community of priests. And therefore, they maintain a high level of ritual purity. But they have a problem. The problem is their teacher, their leader, the teacher of righteousness, had left the temple. Either he was thrown out of the temple, he was passed over for leadership and left in protest. But for reasons that we don't understand, the founder of this community is no longer able to access the temple. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you're a community of priests, that's your primary thing you do is you go to the temple and do the sacrifices. That's no longer accessible to the Qumran community. And further, to make the situation even worse, they're confident that the world itself is about to end. The world as they know it is about to end, and they're about to be reinstated as the legitimate intermediaries between God and Israel, right? So they are uniquely poised, right, to do this, and they think that this is going to happen after a catastrophic battle, as we'll see. Now, the community at Qumran seems to have been very impressed by the Enoch literature. Why do we think that? Because there are lots of manuscripts of the books of Enoch found at Qumran. In fact, it's the third most popular text at Qumran by manuscript attestation. So if we were to take a look at all the different manuscripts of all the different books found at Qumran and count them to see which ones they had the most of, the book of Enoch is third. So that, if you have a community and and you have a library, and that's the main thing that's in your library is the book of Enoch, or at least one of the main things, is important. Secondly, what matters is that it seems like the Qumran community adopted the Enochic calendar. Now remember, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar with solar correction, right? Every 36 months, it solar corrects with the addition of a leap month. So it has a problem, right? It doesn't drift in the same way the Islamic calendar does, but it's not as accurate as the our calendar, right? That we only need a leap day every once in a while. Their solution to this calendrical problem was to introduce and use the Enochic solar calendar, the 365-day calendar. That means that this community would have been celebrating holidays on days not with the rest of the Jewish world. So they are really, in a communal sense, quite cut off in this. Secondly, or thirdly, right, the Yachad thinks of themselves as angel-like. And more than any other community of the ancient time, they are incredibly dedicated to the idea of maintaining a high level of ritual purity, a level of ritual purity not even really needed by priests. So there are, if you go to Qumran, there are mikvahs everywhere. They must have been in and out of those mikvahs all the time. These are ritual immersion pools. It seems like this was a very core component of how they operated on the daily, was through ritual immersion. Why? Because they believed, or at least one of the reasons, is because they believed they were imminently about to engage in a military conflict with the forces of evil. From the war documents, from the war scrolls that we have at Qumran, they believed, it seems, that they were very soon about to engage in military conflict with the angels. The angels were going to come down to heaven and they were going to fight against the forces of Belial, which was their name for the devil. It's also the name that Jesus typically uses, but the forces of Belial, and specifically their earthly component known as the Kittim. Now, the Kittim are almost certainly the Romans. So what they think is going to happen is that the angels are going to come down, the forces of the devil are going to come down, they're all going to slam into each other into a titanic battle, and they're going to lose that battle. They're going to fight throughout the day. They're going to lose basically all day, and they're going to be greatly massacred during the day. A lot of martyrs are going to get made, and then at the night, the angels are going to come down and slaughter the Kittim, and they'll be reinstituted back into the temple, and the world will be basically purified, and they'll be in charge of things, because that's what all apocalyptic cults believe, is that everyone else is wrong, we're right, and we're going to kill them all. So this is what we see in the war literature. What matters is that they have to maintain a high degree of ritual purity, because otherwise they cannot be in the camp with the angels. This is the reason why we think that there are no women and there are no children at Qumran, or very little women and children, because these people, it seems like, are ritually keeping themselves at a high level of purity, because the moment the angels come, they need to be able to enter the angelic camp to engage militarily with the Romans. And if we listen to Josephus, which again, you can always take Josephus for what he's worth, right? We do know that during the Great Rebellion, the Essenes did fight against the Romans. They had their own military commanders, strategoi. They had their own military commanders, and they did fight against the Romans, and they were massacred down to the last man. And that makes some sense, because probably in their mind, when they went to fight with the Romans, they thought, we're going to get slaughtered, and then God's going to show up at night. Well, God never showed up. They all got slaughtered, and their scrolls sat in those caves for 2,000 years. So this is a place where keeping it apocalyptic can go wrong, because you can really drink the Kool-Aid and really believe God's going to come save you, and that you being massacred is actually a good thing. Well, again, another great example in history of one of the lessons we have at Esoterica is, if your battle plans involve God saving you, stay home. But this business of becoming angel-like is very, very important, because again, they have to be able to go into the camp of the angels in order to fight with them to defeat the Kittim. So it's very important that they try to become angel-like. And what we see in the Hodeo literature, in this Thanksgiving literature, and in what is called the self-glorification hymn, it seems like they're able to go into the angelic choir and sing in that choir. And if they're able to go into that choir, and it's often the language is we, right? Or in the case of the self-glorification hymn, right? The idea is they're able to uniquely go and join the angels in the celestial sacrifices, the celestial temple. Why? Because they maintain this incredibly high level of ritual purity. And in all of these hymns, like the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice and the Hodeo literature, Thanksgiving literature, and the self-glorification hymn, we have the idea that you can be transformed into an angel and therefore enter into the divine choir. Now, this kind of mysticism, which Schaeffer refers to as unio liturgica, right? Not unio mystica, like mysticism, unio mysticism of God, but you are able to engage in the divine liturgy with the angels. Now, by the way, this idea does survive into Judaism. There are on Yom Kippur, which is the day in which we become the most angel-like, through fasting, through wearing white, through praying. This is the reason why, by the way, Jews still pray with their legs together. right? With both legs together, rocking back and forth, because the angels only have one leg. This process of angelification consistently lives on in Judaism, and to this day, there are certain hymns that are only sang on Yom Kippur night, because those hymns are reserved specifically for the angels, and it is only on Yom Kippur night that you're able to be angel-like and sing those hymns. This is a custom that persists down to this day. So the self-glorification hymn perhaps is one of the most impressive texts that we've recovered, because it's clearly the idea, this text was probably written by the teacher of righteousness himself, where at a very high level of purification, he's able to be transformed into a divine king. And in fact, a divine king that can be king over all kings. Now, that language of becoming a divine king who's king over all kings, that idea of being transformed in that way should sound a lot like Jesus, should sound a lot like Paul's theology. And to me, the self-glorification hymn, you could, if I told you that it was about Jesus, you would easily believe me, especially if you're a Pauline theologian or in some way. So these are texts that again are precursors to the kind of literature now that eventually will become the Hekhalot literature, in the sense that we have a priestly literature of people ascending. And that's going to matter because in the Hekhalot literature, Rabbi Ishmael, along with Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Ishmael is very important because he is a priest. And him having him coming from a priestly family allows him greater ease of travel, I say, into the palaces here as well. But again, what's missing from this literature? We have angelification, we have ascent literature, we have the idea that you can ascend and sing, but we have no descriptions of the ascent, and we have no descriptions of divine visions. We have no depictions of God. Because again, the apocalyptic imagines God, as much as it imagines God, as being fundamentally transcendent, and therefore the divine is radically absent. And what has to happen is you need an intermediary. And what happened to this community? The priesthood becomes the intermediary. The teacher of righteousness becomes the intermediary as a kind of elevated divine figure. And by the way, the teacher of righteousness, if we look at the Pesher of the Habakkuk Pesher and other texts, it seems like he believed that he was going to suffer before his death and become glorified after death and return somehow. That seems to be a thing that, in fact, there are verses in the New Testament, and there are verses, and there are sections in the Dead Sea Scrolls where both these texts have come to the exact same conclusion about some kind of purification through suffering and then a resurrection. And it is shocking. Now, Jesus probably was not an Essene. He did not seem to have like a lot of, he didn't really care about ritual purity. It wasn't a thing that it seemed to concern him greatly. And also he was quite relaxed about the Sabbath. And these are things I think the Essenes would have found horrifying. So I don't think that he was an Essene, but I do think as an apocalyptic preacher like Jesus was, they're coming to similar conclusions, even though they're quite different in practice. Let's get out of the land of Israel for a minute. Let's go over a little bit to Philo, because Philo is going to matter in this enormously, right? Philo is going to imagine this and is going to also is going to matter because in some ways, Philo represents the Greek wing, the Hellenistic wing of a similar kind of ascent story. And when we get to the Hekhalot literature, it'll be, of course, essentially Jewish literature, but it is Jewish literature that is happening within the larger Hellenistic world. And therefore, we can't simply isolate Judaism outside of Hellenism, because in many ways, the Judaism of this time period is an extension of Hellenism insofar as they are colonial subjects or post-colonial subjects in the process of the wider Hellenization of the world. But Philo posits that another intermediary, his intermediary between God, who's, again, for Philo, as a good Middle Platonist, God is completely unknowable. If you've read your Plotinus, right, he's already prefigured in Philo. The God of Philo is utterly unknowable. That creates the logical problem. The logical problem is you need an intermediary. Who's the intermediary in Philo? The Logos, the Word. Now, again, this is going to be taken wholesale into the New Testament in some ways, or at least a similar kind of idea. But the Logos, the divine word, coming out of Stoicism primarily, is the bridge to the divine. And the way that we connect to the divine and ascend to the divine is that we have Logos too. Our mind is Logos. In fact, our mind is kind of a region of the divine mind. And by turning inward into our mind, we can scale back up into the heavens and connect to the Logos. We can connect to the Logos, and by connecting to the Logos via our mind, again, Logos can mean reason, word, all kind of stuff. He says that our mind undergoes a process of emptying. I mean, I always imagine like a television set. If you've ever had like an uncle or something that just flips through the channels on the TV and never watches anything, imagine your mind like that, just flipping through channels, constantly being stimulated by things. The idea is if you can just get to one channel and then turn the TV off, then God can reconnect directly to your mind. By emptying out your mind, you can connect to the divine mind. And this kind of divine possession vacates the contents of the mind, according to Philo. And when it vacates the mind, your mind then can reconnect to its divine source. And he, in fact, refers to this as divine possession, that the divine actually possesses you. And he compares it, interestingly enough, to the ecstasies of the Bacchants and the Corybantes. So he's comparing it to the mystical states induced by the Greek mysteries. Now he's saying this can happen through pure intellection, but the result is that you end up in a frenzied state, very much like the Greek mysteries. Now, you can't induce this. You can't make it happen. God has to, at some level, do it. But you can train the mind by diminishing focus on the body. So the mind focused on the body will not become divinely possessed. But the mind not focused on the body through asceticism, through intellectual labor, through contemplating the intelligibles, if you shift your attention of your mind in that direction, God can induce this kind of possession. And you can ascend into what he calls the utmost vault of the intelligibles. This is the world of the forms. This is the Platonic realm of the forms. So you can go into the realm of the utmost vault of the intelligibles, but you can't go any higher than that. So again, Philo, for all of his Hellenization, right, you would expect that he would go full Hellenization and say you could become reunited with God. But Philo's a Jew. He maintains to a high degree the idea that God is radically transcendent and there is no unity with God. But you can get to the world of the forms, which, it's not nothing. So you can at least get back to the world of the intelligibles. So what happens here is that Philo has the idea of mystical ascent, but mystical ascent through noesis, right? Through the mind. A bit different than the spiritual ascent, the ascent of the soul, and over in the more Jewish literature, but still a comparative idea here. And further, right, your regular soul can't do it. It has to undergo some sense of transformation, some sense of purification. And once it's purified, right, you can ascend back to the world of the intelligibles. Now, this can happen during life. In fact, we have a word for people for whom this happens to during life. Those people are called prophets. Prophets are simply the people who, for whatever reason, they've managed to get their mind primed such that God can possess them. And when prophets say, "Thus saith the Lord," it is in fact the Lord speaking through them. The Logos is speaking through them because they're no longer there. Their mind is emptied out. The Lord jacks in and out spills the prophecy. You become a direct conduit, right? And this is the word, prophetes is important here, to speak on the behalf of, speak for. But rather than speaking for, literally you are plugged directly into the divine mind and the divine ideas are flowing out of your mouth. So prophets for Philo are people who are able to accomplish this during their lifetime. And of course, Moses is going to be the big guy in all of this. But everybody can achieve this in the afterlife, as long as you prepare your life for the moment in which your soul will exit your body. And if you've prepared your life such that when your soul exits your body and you're purified, your soul will return to the world of the intelligibles. And this is very important because that's exactly the kind of stuff that Socrates would say, right? Philosophy is preparation for death. Now, why do you need to get prepared for death? Because if your soul is focused on the body, it will kind of hover around the body, and that becomes ghosts and stuff like that. But for Philo and other Middle Platonists, you prepare the mind correctly, you can ascend back to the world of the intelligibles after death. To my knowledge, Philo, I don't think, Philo never says he's been able to achieve this. It's achievable, but to my knowledge, Philo never says that he was able to do it, right? And even Plotinus, by the way, Plotinus said it only happened to him twice. So again, we're talking about a couple hundred years later. Even Plotinus, who, I mean, the mystic par excellence in the Western world, he's like, yeah, it happened to me twice. So already we're having a conversation happening in the Jewish world that's going to extend out into the larger pagan world. Now, one thing last to say about Philo before we move on, there's very little evidence that Philo had any impact on anything other than Philo. No one really quotes him during his lifetime, and primarily it seems like Christians picked him up. And Christians, looking at the idea of the Logos as sort of a divine intermediary, and many other ideas coming from Philo, it's primarily Christians who preserve Philo, and it doesn't seem like he was terribly impressive upon Jews. In fact, he only visits Judea a couple of times. And he was really rich. He donated some money to the temple, but he doesn't really seem to really care. And you can imagine why he doesn't really care about a temple where they're burning a bunch of animals. Can you imagine all of that being like, yeah, this is how we connect to God. We burn animals. He's like, that's not how you connect to God. What are you talking about? This is weird, superstitious nonsense. You use your mind. You don't burn animals. But again, this shows you that the Alexandrine intellectual Hellenistic Judaism already is coming up against the more Judaism operating in Palestine. Now, this is the slide that is the rabbit hole slide, if there ever was a rabbit hole slide. The Hekhalot literature, the apocalyptic literature, must be set in a larger context of the wider Eastern Mediterranean. The wider Eastern Mediterranean of the hinge of the Common Era, 2nd century, 1st century, BCE, 1st century, 2nd century of the Common Era. There were a dozen of these ascent schools. Ascension was just on the philosophical and spiritual agenda of everybody. Everybody was interested in ascent. Now, if we look at traditional Egyptian religion, they have the revivification of the Ach and ascending via their traditional religious practices. The afterlife also develops in Judaism in a profound way. We get the first glimpses of the afterlife during this time period, and you can ascend either in this life and especially in the afterlife to the heavens, and in there you can see the divine glory. That's a completely novel idea in Judaism around this time period. The Stoics. Now, we don't think of the Stoics as typically that interested in otherworldliness because they were physicalists, right? They were materialists. They believed that. But think about what the Stoics are up to. They wanted to align their will with the Logos. They align their Logos with the Logos and commune with the Logos. I would argue that the Stoics developed a kind of mysticism, a rationalist mysticism. That sounds strange to us because we're weird, not them. But they developed a kind of rationalist mysticism in which they could commune with the divine mind through all kinds of things, including liturgy. Remember, Cleanthes writes the hymn to Zeus. He's writing Stoic liturgy. And Stoic liturgy, that's clearly pushing the limits into a kind of Stoic religiosity. Where we think of Stoicism now, unfortunately, because all tech bros, it's sort of like, don't feel your feelings. It's not that. It's that feelings are often just mostly mistaken, and therefore you need to realign your will and your Logos with the divine Logos, and you don't have all these erratic, bizarre feelings. So even in Stoicism, I would say there's an element of it's here. Of course, Hermeticism. The entire goal of Hermeticism is auto-exorcism. You purge your body of astral demons, and that allows you to ascend either in this life and especially in the afterlife. In this life, we do have evidence that they had some ascents, because if you read the discourse of the 8th and the 9th, that's clearly a person talking as if or after having made the ascent. Now, can you go all the way back to the divine light in this light? Probably not. But can you get close in this life? Seemingly. And that's a system where you are literally going up through the structures of the heavens and getting out to the 8th and the 9th. And if you've ever read the discourse in the 8th and the 9th, as it's found in the Nag Hammadi library, it's ecstatic. I mean, it becomes so overwhelming that it transitions into chants, basically, these sort of divine chants. So a very powerful text in that way. Of course, the Gnostics. The Gnostics also, despite the fact there's a lot of difference among the Gnostics, they're all interested in getting the hell out of here. For them, this is a prison. This whole physical world's a prison created by an evil god, a lesser evil god, and they want to be able to over in Alexandria. They're the Therapeutai. These are Jewish monks, probably some kind of monks, who spend their entire life meditating on ascension, trying to become prophets and ascending their soul. And Philo knows about them. We only know about them through Philo. But clearly, right, they are Therapeutai. They're trying to therapy their soul. They're trying to treat their soul and trying to ascend. So they're living in a very monastic way over there by Lake Mariotte, just over by Alexandria. Neoplatonism, of course, Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism will introduce probably one of the most important concepts in the Western mysticism, the idea of procession and recession, the idea that the divine processed out, emanated out reality, and because everything is an extension of the divine, and our souls are part of that divine procession, there's also an equal return, a recession back into the divine, and that if you are intentional about this through contemplation, through living a good life, through morality, and through theurgy, of course, for Iamblichus, you can intentionally jumpstart and kickstart and accelerate the process of recession back to the divine. So this is an idea that's core. It will obviously live on in Pseudo-Dionysius, and it lives on in the Christian tradition, and it will live on in Kabbalah and all kinds of other things. So this idea also develops. But again, at the core of it, it's an ascent theory. It's a theory for how we got here and how to get back. And finally, right, in the magical literature, right, we have the Mithras liturgy, perhaps in my opinion, the most outstanding piece of magical technology from the ancient world. In the Mithras liturgy, again, we have the combination of both liturgy and magic in the form of some kind of herbs. We don't know what the famous Contritis herb that may have been psychedelic in some kind of way. We don't know, because we don't know what the Contritis root was. But in the Mithras liturgy, you literally float. You physically experience floating. They describe the phenomenology of floating to the heavens, and you are able to penetrate into the world of the divine, and that is the role of what's going on in the Mithras liturgy in the Greek magical papyri. And lastly, for our purposes, the most important person in this early history of ascent technology for Hekhalot literature and for our purposes here is surprisingly a Christian. Paul of Tarsus is our earliest witness to this ascent technology in the first person at all. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, Paul says, look, I know a guy who ascended to the third heaven, and he heard unutterable things. And it's Paul, right, who for the first time says, not only did I ascend, and eventually he says, yeah, the guy I know is me, I ascended to the third heaven, I heard things, and not only that, but what's going to happen is that Christ was a kind of pre-existent entity, a glorified entity who came down, became a body, took on a body, and died and reascended back into heaven. And if you trust in his ascent, you'll ascend too. Right? Again, when you hear the word faith here, I know we hear the word faith because we often come from a Protestant world where faith means believing things without evidence. That's not what faith means in the New Testament. Faith means trust, pistis. If you trust in the ascent of Christ, what can you trust in the fact that he did it? Well, if you trust in the fact that he did it, what might you believe potentially you can do? You can do it too. And what's that process? After you've died, and if you've had trust in his ascent, you will undergo the exact same process. Paul says, very soon the world's going to come to an end, and your body will be transformed into a glorified body. That's the exact language that we've been seeing in the apocalyptic literature, and that's the exact same language we've been seeing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What we have in Paul is the idea of a radical democratization of the apocalyptic imminently. I mean, he says, some of you aren't going to die. Some of you are, he's like, don't get married and don't make new businesses. Not because marriage is bad, right? It's because literally it's stupid. Why get married? We're all going to be glorified soon. Why make a new, none of this is going to matter. Like 2 weeks from now. Paul believes this is about to imminently happen. In the same way that the Essenes believe they're about to imminently engage with the Romans, right? And with angels and fight the Romans, Paul thought the world's about to be transformed, and in a fundamental way, all of us were going to be subject to the apocalypse. So I want you to see the transition here as we wrap up for today. We'll talk a lot about Paul next time. The transition has gone from Enoch as an individual who gets to see visions of the upper worlds, right? Then we get slowly to a larger division, right? The larger division is the entire community of the Yachad, of the Dead Sea Scroll people, will get to ascend. And finally, by the time we get to Paul, everybody can do it. You just have to trust JC. So already by Paul, we have had a radical democratization of the apocalyptic. But notice still, in Paul, in these other texts, you can't induce it. You can't. You can't make it happen. God has to do it, right? But end of the world has to happen for Paul. The world has to come to an end, right? There has to be some other outside mechanism by which this process happens. What's going to be revolutionary in the Hekhalot literature is, again, as I said a moment ago, this is the apocalyptic made praxes. You can induce the apocalypse. Maybe not for everybody, but for you, maybe your community. This is practical apocalypticism. We go from only Enoch, only priests, only this one community, everybody, right? In Paul, we can see a shift in the scope of the apocalyptic. And the Hekhalot literature is going through the technology by which it says, you can do it too. Anybody can do it. Here's how, but it's real dangerous. But before we get to there, we got to take a little detour. And that detour is perhaps the most important mystical vision in Western history, perhaps the most important vision in human history. And that is this guy's vision, because he went into the heavens, Paul of Tarsus, he met the glorified Christ. And what did the glorified Christ tell him to do? Take this idea to the Gentiles. The Jesus movement, under the leadership of James, under the leadership of Jesus, was a Jewish movement with very little interest of converting non-Jews. This ascent vision, where Paul ascends into the third heaven and meets Christ, probably in Jerusalem, as we'll see, is going to have unimaginable ramifications for the world. Because what goes from a very small clique of Jewish apocalypticists waiting for the end of the world becomes a worldwide movement. Why? Because Paul is told by Christ to take this gospel, his gospel, Paul's gospel, to the Gentile world. And that is going to transform the messianic movement of John the Baptizer and Jesus of Nazareth to a worldwide, Roman-wide moment. And I want to put a fine point on this before we end. It could be the case, and I do think it is the case, that Christianity becomes the religion that it is because of an ascent vision. The ascent vision of Paul is the linchpin instance where we go from a relatively small, relatively parochial Jewish apocalyptic sect to a Roman-wide and to a worldwide religious movement. This ascent technology is going to transform the world. And the degree to which Paul is a kind of proto-Merkavah mystic, right? And again, we're going to have to do some work here. But if it's the case that Paul, as a kind of proto-Merkavah mystic, and I think that he was, that means that some version of this Merkavah mysticism has transformed the world, because it transformed the gospel. The gospel went from the very parochial gospel of Jesus to the universal gospel of Paul. And therefore, I would argue the ascent technologies that we're talking about here We are now all living in the aftermath of one of these vis-a-vis Paul. So what we'll do next week, we're going to come back to Paul, and we're going to try our best to reconstruct what his ascent vision was. What happened? What did it mean? And how did it affect things? Because once we get to that in the 50s of the Common Era, we can then begin to see, maybe this is why the rabbis in the Gemara are so nervous about this stuff, because they've seen it cash out in what to them was quite a frightening heresy, frankly. This Christian heresy stuff. And also in Elisha ben Abuya, right? You can see, we're going to see the Paul ascent, the Elisha ascent. This ascent literature is going to be something that's going to put them it's going to put the rabbis at arm's length. But they're going to be our first glimpse into this mysticism, into the Hekhalot mysticism. So our itinerary, Paul, the rabbis, and then we will come directly in contact with the descenders in their own voice, right? In their own language, in their own technology, and we'll get a glimpse of this technology as we'll see it. But first, we have to travel through the gate of Paul, because Paul is going to be our first historical glimpse into a person saying, this isn't Enoch doing it. This is not the Echad. This was me. I did this. It happened to me. And that moment, that shift from the literary to the subjective is to me incredibly decisive. Incredibly decisive. So we'll return next week to be called up to the third heaven with Paul of Tarsus and the gospel that frankly transformed the world. No, we won't. We'll never wrap up the apocalyptic. The apocalyptic will wrap us up.